I kept the warmth in this house for 30 years. I baked, ironed, supported, organized family holidays. I never asked for much, just to be included, at least in the important moments. But this year, on our anniversary, there was no call, no flowers, not even a short message. They forgot, all of them. And that's when I realized if they don't need my celebration, then it will be mine, mine alone. How did it all end? Let's just say now they're the ones begging to hear a single word from me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Ellen Bradshaw. I was 68 years old, retired from my job as a school librarian in a small town in Vermont. After 35 years surrounded by children's voices, whispers between shelves, and the comforting rustle of turning pages, the silence of retirement came as both a gift and a challenge. My husband, Ted, had passed away 8 years earlier, and since then, I had filled my time with gardening, volunteering at the church library, baking for my grandchildren, and keeping the house exactly as it had always been. I didn't mind being alone. I had grown used to it, but I still held tight to the small rituals that made life feel like it had shape and meaning. That morning, I woke earlier than usual. The light was soft and gray through the curtains, and the wind made the maple branches tap gently against the windows. I put the kettle on and sat for a while in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from mine. I had left it untouched, with the same cushion Ted used to lean against. The space across the table never stopped feeling like his. It was our wedding anniversary. 30 years to the day since we had stood in a small wooden church on the hill outside of town. Me in a borrowed dress with lace sleeves, him with a crooked tie and eyes full of wonder. We had almost no money then, but we had danced under string lights and toasted with cheap champagne. The memory still warmed my chest like a soft ember. Each year since his death, I honored that day quietly, without announcement. I didn't expect much, just a moment of reflection, a few flowers on the table, and maybe a call from one of the children who remembered what the date meant. I pulled the lace tablecloth from the drawer in the dining room. It was the one we had used every year on our anniversary, the one with tiny floral stitching along the hem. I had washed it the day before and ironed it just right. Laying it across the table, I smoothed every wrinkle, adjusting the corners until it was perfectly centered. I set two place settings, like I always did, one for me and one for the man who still lived in my memory. I took out the family china, the plates with the faint blue pattern around the edge, the silverware passed down from my mother. I lit the tall candle in the center of the table. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for me, for the act of remembering. A kind of conversation with the past, spoken in folded napkins and polished forks. In the kitchen, I mixed the ingredients for Ted's favorite pie, sour cherry with just a pinch of cinnamon. As it baked, the scent filled the house, climbing into every corner like it was waking something asleep. I opened the windows a crack to let in the breeze. Outside, the leaves rustled and danced. It was the kind of day he would have loved, cool, golden light, quiet enough to hear your thoughts. After I set the pie to cool, I checked my phone. There were a few notifications, a news update, a discount from the pharmacy, a weather alert about possible rain, no messages, no missed calls. I refreshed it just in case. Nothing. I told myself it was early. Maybe they were waiting until later to call. Maybe they had something planned. I tried not to expect. Expectations at my age felt like stepping onto thin ice. You learned quickly not to put your full weight on them. Still, I checked the phone again at noon, and again at 1. I scrolled through old photos, pausing on the ones from past anniversaries. Me and Ted at the lake house, laughing over a burnt dinner. The children years ago, holding up handmade cards with glitter hearts. A photo from 5 years ago of the whole family sitting around this very table. I stared at their faces, wondering where the time had gone and why some things felt so far away now. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch. The candle still burned in the dining room, flickering softly behind the window. A squirrel darted across the lawn. The mailbox stood empty at the curb. Across the street, the Hendersons were stringing up Halloween lights. I waved when they looked my way. They didn't know what day it was. Why would they? By the late afternoon, the silence in the house had taken on a sharper edge. I moved through the rooms slowly, picking up small objects just to put them back down again. A photo frame, a coaster, a stack of unopened mail. I thought about calling someone, just to chat, but I didn't want to remind anyone of something they had clearly forgotten. That felt worse than silence. I stood in the dining room and looked at the table. The lace cloth was still flawless. The plate sat untouched. The pie had cooled and now waited patiently beneath a glass dome. The chair across from me was still empty. I turned off the candle. The room dimmed slightly. I removed one plate, then the second. I folded the napkins and placed them back in the drawer. I slid the pie into the fridge. There was no anger in me, not really, just a quiet kind of sadness, the kind that didn't need tears or explanations. That night, I ate a small dinner alone, soup from a can and a piece of toast. I didn't light a candle. I didn't sit at the dining table. I ate at the kitchen counter, with the television playing softly in the background. I brushed Teddy behind the ears, gave him a biscuit, and watched him settle onto his blanket in the corner. Before bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the quiet street. I thought about all the years, all the memories layered over each other like pages in an old book. So much love, so much effort. I didn't regret any of it. But I felt something shift inside me, something small and firm, a new thought rising, quiet and sure. If no one else would make this day meaningful, then I would, and next year I would not be sitting at this table again. The next morning, the sky was pale and blank, like a sheet of paper waiting for something to be written on it. I moved slowly through the house, not from fatigue, but from something harder to name, the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from age or illness, but from recognition, a realization that settles over you without ceremony. They had forgotten. I made my usual cup of tea, even though it tasted like nothing. I watched the steam rise and disappear into the still air. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above me, and I sat in silence, holding the warm mug between my hands as if it could anchor me to something solid. The lace tablecloth was still folded on the dining room chair, waiting to be washed. I had left it there on purpose, as if a part of me wanted to see it again first thing in the morning, like it might explain what had happened, or remind me it was real. I checked my phone, nothing new. A few social media updates, photos of pumpkin patches, a new car someone had bought, someone's engagement ring held out like a trophy in a manicured hand. I scrolled for a moment, then put the phone face down on the table. The screen was too bright for how dim I felt. In the living room, the dust caught the morning light in lazy swirls. The kind of quiet that filled the room wasn't peaceful. It was vacant, like the house itself was wondering where everyone had gone. I picked up the throw blanket from the couch and folded it slowly, smoothing the corners until they lined up perfectly. It gave me something to do, even if it changed nothing. By 10, I had convinced myself that someone would call. It was a delay, that's all. People get busy. They mean well, but time moves differently when you have your own distractions. I replayed imagined conversations in my mind, how I would answer when they finally did reach out, how I would pretend not to be hurt, how I would brush it off with a quiet laugh. The rehearsals didn't comfort me. They only deepened the echo of their absence. I decided to take a walk. The air outside was crisp, the leaves brittle underfoot. I passed familiar houses, each one with decorations for fall, wreaths of dried corn, jack-o'-lanterns with toothy smiles, strings of orange lights blinking like they had somewhere better to be. I nodded at a neighbor trimming his hedges. He waved. I kept walking. The world moved on, just as it always did, and I walked among it like a ghost no one could see. At the grocery store, I picked up a few things I didn't need. Some apples, a box of crackers, a magazine I wouldn't read. I stood in line behind a couple arguing softly about dinner plans. Their voices faded as I stared at the impulse buy rack of gum and mints. I wondered briefly if anyone in my family had passed by this same display that morning, unaware of how closely our worlds brushed against each other. Back home, I unpacked the groceries and arranged them neatly in the pantry. I stared at the apples in the bowl on the counter and thought of the orchard Ted and I used to visit in early October. We'd come home with baskets full, and he'd always insist on baking the first pie himself. It never turned out quite right, too tart, too runny, but he grinned like a kid every time. I smiled at the memory, then felt it slip through me like wind through an open door. The phone didn't ring, not even once. I checked it anyway, compulsively, knowing it was futile. I refreshed the screen, tapped the voicemail tab, scrolled through old messages. There was one from my daughter, dated 6 weeks earlier, a quick note about a dentist appointment for her son. I played it just to hear a voice, even if it wasn't meant for me. Later that afternoon, I sat in my bedroom and pulled the shoebox of letters from the closet. Inside were cards from birthdays past, scribbled drawings from when the grandchildren were little, a few notes from Ted, yellowed with time. I ran my fingers over the ink, tracing words that no longer had a sender. They were relics now, frozen echoes of affection once freely given. I didn't cry. That was the part that surprised me most. I thought I would, but the tears didn't come. Instead, there was only a dull ache, like the bruise you press just to remind yourself it's there. I folded the letters and returned them to the box, placing it gently back on the shelf. Dinner that evening was another quiet affair. I boiled pasta, poured a little olive oil, added a pinch of salt. No sauce, no effort. I ate standing at the counter, the house humming softly around me. Outside, the wind picked up, and I could hear the chimes on the porch singing a lonely tune. As night fell, I turned off the lights one by one. The house grew darker, but the silence stayed the same. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. Teddy curled into a ball near my feet. I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift. There had been no call, no message, no visit. They had forgotten me. And somehow that truth settled in without drama, without fanfare, just a simple, silent fact in a house filled with everything but their voices. It was sometime after midnight when I rose from bed. The house was wrapped in shadows, the kind that didn't scare, but made everything feel distant and forgotten. The quiet was so complete that I could hear my own breathing. Teddy shifted in his sleep beside the bed, exhaling a soft sigh. I stepped lightly, not turning on any lights, letting the moon through the kitchen window guide me. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that staying in bed felt impossible. I made a cup of tea and stood by the window while it steeped, cradling the warmth between my palms. The trees outside danced gently in the wind, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows over the pavement. It felt like I was the only person awake in the entire town. There was an odd comfort in that. No expectations, no questions, just stillness. As I sipped, my eyes drifted to the bookshelf in the hallway. At the very bottom, behind some old gardening guides and a stack of outdated cookbooks, was a large flat object wrapped in a canvas sleeve. I hadn't thought of it in years, not since Ted tucked it away after his last round of decluttering. I knelt down and pulled it out, my knees cracking slightly as I did. It was a map, a full-sized paper map of the United States, creased at the folds, faded at the corners. We had bought it decades ago during one of our earlier road trips, back when navigation didn't live inside a glowing screen. We used to mark it with little red dots and stars, circling the places we'd visited and drawing small hearts near the places we said we'd return to someday. It still smelled faintly of old paper and leather. Nostalgia rose in my chest like a tide. I cleared off the kitchen table and spread the map across it, smoothing it with my hands. My fingers traced familiar routes: the highway we took through Pennsylvania, the detour we made in Tennessee to see a sunflower field, the long, meandering drive through Colorado that left us breathless. There were still faint pencil notes in the margins: Best Pie in Kansas, Campground by River, Return, Tiny Diner with Jukebox. And then there were the unmarked places, vast stretches of land we had never touched, empty patches on the map that represented potential, not memory. I stared at them for a long time. My eyes settled on New Mexico, Santa Fe. I had always wanted to go. Something about the light, the desert colors, the way time seemed to stretch wide out there, like it was less about speed and more about presence. I remembered seeing a photo in a travel magazine once: adobe houses, warm terracotta, cobalt skies. I had torn it out and tucked it in my drawer. It was still there, yellowed and curling at the edges. Without thinking, I walked to my laptop and opened a browser. My fingers typed as if they had done it before. Santa Fe vacation rentals. Images filled the screen: casitas with private courtyards, tiny homes with tiled fountains, rooms with wooden beams and sunlight pouring through them. I clicked through a few listings, letting instinct guide me more than logic. There was one that stood out: a small one-bedroom guest house tucked behind an art gallery. It had soft, earth-toned walls, a hammock strung between two trees, and a little kitchen with blue tile backsplash. I stared at the photos until I could almost feel the breeze through the screen. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I booked it, 1 week. No hesitation, no calls, no family consultations, just me. I entered my card number and clicked confirm with a surprising steadiness. It didn't feel impulsive. It felt necessary. Afterward, I stood in the doorway of the living room, looking around at the space that had been mine for so many years. The familiar furniture, the framed family photos, the hand-me-down quilt on the couch. It all looked the same, but I felt different, as if I had just opened a door in my own mind that had been locked for decades. Not out of fear, just out of habit. I opened the hall closet and pulled down my old suitcase. It was dusty, the zippers stiff, but it still held the scent of cedar from the sachet I had tucked inside long ago. I laid it on the bed and unzipped it slowly, savoring the moment. I began packing before sunrise. Comfortable clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, a pair of sandals I had never worn, a few books, my journal, a camera I hadn't touched in years. I folded everything neatly, not because anyone would see it, but because it felt like an offering to myself. I left a note on the kitchen table before I went to sleep. It was short: Gone on vacation. Don't worry. I'll be in touch soon. I didn't sign it. They'd know it was from me. Whether they'd care or not, I couldn't say. But for once, that didn't matter. That morning, I watched the sun rise from the front porch with my suitcase by my side. The town still slept. The air was brisk, and in my chest, something bloomed, small but certain, a sense that I had stepped into a life that had been waiting for me to choose it. Not a new life, just a truer version of the one I'd almost forgotten I could still have. I looked out at the quiet street and smiled to myself. The map was still open on the table inside, but it had already done its job. It had reminded me of where I hadn't been, and that was all the compass I needed. The moment I stepped out of the small regional airport in Santa Fe, I knew I had made the right choice. The air was dry, but not harsh. It carried with it the scent of dust, juniper, and something else I couldn't name. Something warm and slow, like sunlight baked into adobe. The sky stretched endlessly above me, impossibly blue, as if it had never known clouds. I stood still for a while, letting it all wash over me. The rental car was a compact silver hatchback with sticky gears and a radio that only played one station. I didn't care. I rolled down the windows and let the wind tangle my hair as I drove through unfamiliar streets lined with clay-colored homes, brightly painted doors, and weathered fences covered in vines. The buildings seemed to rise from the earth itself, like they belonged here in a way people never truly could. Every block smelled like roasted chilies and wood smoke. The guest house was tucked behind a quiet art gallery on a side street paved with gravel and shadowed by tall cottonwood trees. The owner, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s, handed me the key and a paper map of the area. She didn't ask questions. She just pointed to the courtyard and said, "The light's best in the evening." Then she disappeared back into the gallery, leaving me alone with the chirping of birds and the rustle of dry leaves. Inside the casita, everything was small, sun-warmed, and perfect. Terracotta tiles on the floor, a little kitchenette with hand-painted mugs, a window that looked out onto a wall of flowering cactus. There was a bed with crisp white sheets, a wooden desk by the window, and shelves lined with books about the Southwest, desert photography, poetry, cookbooks full of spice and color. I unpacked slowly, placing each item with care, like arranging a still life meant only for myself. Later that afternoon, I walked to a nearby market. The streets were quiet, shaded by the buildings, humming with a kind of slowness I hadn't felt in years. I bought local honey, a small wedge of soft cheese, 2 green apples, and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. The woman at the counter asked if I wanted a bag, and I said no. I carried everything in my arms, feeling the weight of it, the simplicity, the act of choosing food just for me. No lists, no compromises, no thoughts of who liked what. Felt revolutionary. Back in the casita, I ate my bread and cheese in the courtyard. The bench was slightly uneven, and the table had a crack running through the middle, but the sunlight poured over everything with the kind of golden patience I had only read about in novels. I took my time. I let each bite linger. Even the air seemed edible, rich with heat and pine and the faint scent of wildflowers. As the sun dipped lower, I explored the narrow streets nearby. I passed small shops selling silver jewelry, woven blankets, and hand-carved wooden figurines. I didn't buy anything. I didn't need to. Just looking felt enough. A man played guitar on the corner of a quiet plaza, his notes drifting upward like smoke. A child laughed somewhere in the distance, and the sound didn't hurt. It didn't remind me of what was missing. It simply was. When the sky turned orange and purple, I returned to the guest house and sat on the steps leading into the garden. I watched as the stars began to appear, one by one, shy at first, then bold. There were so many more than I could ever see from home. I tilted my head back and breathed deeply. The air tasted like something I had forgotten to crave. Freedom, maybe, or solitude without loneliness. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't performing. I wasn't filling a role. I was just here. I didn't check my phone that night. I turned it off, slid it into the drawer beside the bed, and left it there. No part of me was curious about who had or hadn't noticed my absence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was just elsewhere, and for once, that was exactly what I wanted. I read for a while before bed, some old collection of desert poems left on the shelf. One line stayed with me as I drifted into sleep. The land forgets your name, then welcomes you as wind. I didn't understand it fully, but it wrapped itself around my heart like a shawl. That night, I dreamed of open roads, of red hills and vast skies. I dreamed of dancing alone in a field where no one watched and nothing was expected. When I woke the next morning, the air still tasted the same, like something just mine, warm and untouched by anyone else's hands. The first time the phone rang, I was sitting on the cool tile floor of the guest house, arranging a stack of postcards I had picked up from a local market. They were beautiful, sun-bleached landscapes, adobe churches, pottery, desert blooms caught in that magic hour light. I had planned to send a few of them to friends back home, maybe even one to the kids, if the right words ever came. But when I heard the vibration on the wooden table and saw the screen light up with my daughter's name, I didn't move. I watched it ring. I let it fade into silence. I knew why they were calling. Eventually, someone had realized I was gone. Maybe they had driven by the house. Maybe a neighbor mentioned something. Or maybe, finally, someone had remembered what day it had been. But I didn't want explanations. I didn't want apologies delayed by convenience. I wanted space. The second call came later that night, this time from my son. I was in the bathtub, the light off, the window cracked just enough to let the cool night air in. The water had gone tepid, but I stayed, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant sound of a train. The phone buzzed on the counter, but I didn't reach for it. I had nothing to say that wouldn't come out sounding like a question I no longer needed answered. In the morning, I checked the screen. 6 missed calls, 2 voicemails, 1 text. Are you okay? I stared at the words. They didn't anger me. They didn't soothe me. They simply existed, a digital whisper from people who had remembered me only when I was no longer within reach. I opened the message and read it again, then put the phone down without responding. Later that afternoon, I sat at a cafe on the edge of a quiet street, sipping iced tea and watching people walk by. Couples, friends, solitary strangers. Some were laughing. Others looked like they were carrying something invisible. I imagined their lives briefly, the weight of their stories, the things they might also be trying to escape or find. It felt comforting to be part of a crowd that didn't know me. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't a widow. I was just a woman having tea on a warm day. The waitress asked if I wanted anything else. I smiled and said no, then returned to my thoughts. My phone buzzed again in my purse, and this time I didn't even look. I let it ring like wind brushing against a window, present but not intrusive. Back at the guest house, I took a walk around the garden. The cacti bloomed in defiance of their harsh environment, little bursts of color in dry soil. I bent down and touched the edge of a bright red blossom. It was soft, surprisingly delicate. I thought about how long it must take for something so beautiful to appear in a place so unforgiving. I sat in the hammock beneath the cottonwood tree and opened the book I'd been meaning to read for years. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked. I read for hours, stopping only to watch the light change on the garden walls. At some point, the phone rang again. I didn't flinch. I didn't even glance. The number would still be there later. If not, it wouldn't matter. That night, I cooked dinner for myself, pan-roasted vegetables and soft cheese on fresh bread. I poured a glass of wine and ate slowly at the small wooden table in the courtyard. A candle flickered beside me, casting shadows that danced along the adobe walls. I raised the glass slightly, not in a toast to anyone else, but to the moment, to my own company. Before bed, I turned on the phone and played the first voicemail. My daughter's voice trembled slightly. She said they were worried, that they had come by and found the house empty. She asked where I had gone, why I hadn't said anything. She ended with, "Please, just let us know you're all right." I played the second voicemail, my son this time, shorter, more practical. "Mom, call me, please." No mention of the anniversary, no apology, just the expectation that I would respond. I turned the phone off again. In the silence that followed, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. There was something powerful in withholding the answer they expected, in not rushing to fill their discomfort. I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting something I had only just rediscovered: my autonomy, my rhythm, my right to disappear without asking permission. As I lay in bed, I thought about all the times I had dropped everything to pick up their calls: the late night rides, the emergency babysitting, the constant emotional labor that went unnoticed, unthanked, assumed. And here, in this quiet desert city, I had no responsibilities, only choices. I didn't know when I would return their calls. Maybe in a few days, maybe not at all. I hadn't decided yet. What I did know was this: the world had not ended in my absence. No one had come searching until the silence had become inconvenient, and that told me everything I needed to know. I left Santa Fe on a morning that smelled like rain, though the sky stayed clear. The road back to the airport wound through stretches of desert and scrub brush, the kind of landscape that looked eternal, like it could outlast everything. As I drove, I didn't listen to music. I wanted to hold on to the silence a little longer, the kind I had only just started to understand. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of being alone without apology. The plane was small, the kind where the engines always sounded too loud and the seats were too close. I sat by the window and watched the earth fall away beneath me, shrinking until the vastness of the desert was just a pattern, a memory stitched into the land. I didn't speak to the passenger beside me. I didn't read or sleep. I just let myself sit in the in-between, that strange place where you're not anywhere anymore, not quite gone, not quite home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the leaves on the maple tree had turned fully. Reds, oranges, and deep yellows painted the yard with a kind of fire. The porch light was on, though I hadn't set a timer. The house looked exactly the same as when I left. That was what struck me the most, that nothing had changed. No sign of disruption, no message left in chalk on the walk, no bouquet waiting in a vase. Just stillness, familiar and indifferent. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Teddy padded out from the hallway, tail wagging slowly, as if unsure whether to greet me or wait for permission. I knelt down and scratched behind his ears. His body pressed against mine with a softness I hadn't realized I missed. I whispered something to him, not words, just a sound, and he stayed close as I moved through the house. Everything was in its place, the calendar still marked with the anniversary date, circled in red ink, the pile of mail stacked neatly on the hall table, a few flyers from the local grocery store, a postcard from a friend in Maine, and a letter from my daughter, sealed in a pale blue envelope resting atop the others. I didn't open it. Not yet. In the kitchen, the light through the window fell exactly as it always had, casting lines across the tile like a sundial. I placed my suitcase near the pantry and filled the kettle. As the water boiled, I stood by the window and looked out at the backyard. The garden had overgrown slightly, but the flowers were still standing. A few bright patches of color held on, even through the shift in seasons. I felt something inside me mirror that, a quiet endurance, persistent and bright. I ate dinner alone that evening, a sandwich and a bowl of soup I found in the freezer, reheated and eaten at the small table by the window. No candles, no music, just the soft clink of spoon against ceramic. I didn't mind. The silence no longer pressed in around me. It felt like part of the house now, like the creak of the floorboards or the ticking of the clock. That night, I lit a fire in the living room, not because it was cold, but because I wanted to watch the flames. I sat in the armchair with a blanket over my lap and let the heat wash over me. The letter still sat unopened on the counter. The phone, too, remained silent. I had turned it on briefly earlier, just long enough to clear the notifications. Dozens of messages. I didn't read them. Eventually, I picked up the letter. My daughter's handwriting hadn't changed. It was careful, precise, always slanting slightly to the left. I held it for a moment, then slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the paper inside. It was short. She said she was sorry. She said they should have remembered. She said she hoped I was all right, that I hadn't left because of them, that they missed me. But I had left because of them, not to punish, but to reclaim. And reading her words didn't undo that truth. It just added a layer to it. Acknowledgement, late but genuine. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with old birthday cards and recipes written in my mother's hand. It belonged there, part of the history, not the future. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I made coffee and drank it slowly, watching the world outside turn from gray to gold. A bird landed on the railing of the porch, stayed for a few seconds, then disappeared. I didn't feel the ache I used to feel, the quiet hunger for someone to call, someone to knock on the door. I had brought back something from that trip that no one could see but me, a sense of my own company as enough. Later, I began making a list, not of chores or errands, but of places, cities I hadn't seen, trails I hadn't walked, cafes where no one knew my name. I wrote them down one by one in a small notebook and placed it by the front door, not as a threat, not as an escape plan, but as a promise to myself. It happened on a Wednesday, mid-morning, after the fog had lifted and the house was filled with a quiet sort of light, the kind that comes through sheer curtains and feels soft on the skin. I had just finished sweeping the front porch. There were dry leaves caught in the corners, little reminders that the seasons had kept moving even while I had paused. The phone rang from the kitchen table. I saw the name before I picked it up. My son. I hadn't spoken to him since before the trip, and for a moment, my thumb hovered over the screen. There had been other calls, other messages, but I had ignored them all. This time, I didn't. I answered. His voice was tentative at first, the way people speak when they know they might be stepping into something fragile. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't demand explanations. He just said, "Hi, Mom," and waited. I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence hang for a second longer than necessary, And then I said hello. It wasn't a long call. It wasn't dramatic or tearful or full of revelations. It was awkward. It was careful. But it was real. He told me he'd stopped by the house a few days ago and seen the garden, said it looked nice. I said thank you. He told me he'd found the note on the table but didn't know what to make of it. I told him it wasn't meant to be explained. He paused, then said he missed me. He didn't dress it up in sentimentality. He didn't try to spin it into something tidy. He just said the words like someone not used to saying them out loud. It landed somewhere deep, past the places that had been sore. I didn't cry. I didn't offer comfort. I simply received the words and held them quietly. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Why didn't you tell us you were leaving? I thought about lying, about giving him an easy version, something like, I needed a break, or I wanted some sun. But I had told myself I wouldn't do that anymore. I wouldn't protect them from the truth just because it made them uncomfortable. So I told him. I said that I had waited and no one came, that I had set a table for memories, and everyone else had been too busy to notice the date, that I had spent a day that once meant something surrounded by silence, and it had pushed me to remember something important, that I didn't have to wait for permission to live. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He let it settle between us. There was something in his voice after that. Not shame, not guilt, just softness. He said he hadn't realized how far things had slipped. He said he was sorry. And for the first time, I believed that he meant it. He asked if he could come by sometime, maybe bring the kids. I said yes, but not today. I told him I needed time to figure out how to come back to the world they'd left me out of. I didn't say it to hurt him. I said it because it was true. There are things you can forgive instantly, and there are things that need space to be felt before they can be healed. He said he understood. I hoped he did. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The sunlight had shifted. The shadows were longer now. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, and I stood to make tea. Everything felt the same, but my chest was lighter. Not fixed, not full, but lighter. I took the tea to the back porch and sat with it, letting the steam rise and warm my face. I thought about the conversation, about how vulnerability isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice saying, I missed you. Sometimes it's an answer without defense. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't need to. For now, I had spoken. For now, I had been heard. And that was a beginning I hadn't expected, but maybe had hoped for all along. The anniversary came around again, just as I knew it would. It was quiet, the way all days are at first. Just a date on the calendar, waiting to be noticed. The leaves had begun to fall early that year, and the air had the kind of chill that made your joints ache in the morning, but somehow felt comforting too. I didn't need a reminder. My body remembered. My memory remembered. But this year, I didn't wait. I packed my suitcase the night before. I folded my clothes neatly and placed them in the same old suitcase with the worn leather handle and the frayed zipper. It was smaller than what most people use for travel now, but I liked that. I liked how it made me choose carefully. I brought a book of poetry, a worn notebook, a scarf Ted had given me 20 years ago, and a camera that still worked if you tapped it twice before pressing the shutter. This time, I drove. Not far, just a few hours north, into the hills where the trees turned a deeper gold and the roads curled like ribbon through quiet towns. I had rented a cabin near a lake. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden space with a fireplace, a porch swing, and a view of the water that caught the sky in the early morning like glass. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and the floorboards creaked in the most comforting way. I made tea and sat outside with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the sky go from pink to orange to deep, endless blue. A bird called from somewhere in the trees. Somewhere behind me, a branch cracked. The world felt wide, but not empty. In the morning, I woke up with the sun. The lake was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask questions. I made breakfast for myself: eggs, toast, a slice of cheese, and a bit of jam I had brought in a jar from home. I set the table for one. I didn't light a candle. I didn't place a second chair. I didn't need to. After breakfast, I went for a walk along the lake's edge. The trees reflected on the water, distorted and beautiful. I picked up leaves as I walked, pressing them between the pages of my notebook. Red, gold, copper. I wrote down what I saw, not because I wanted to remember later, but because writing made me feel like I was honoring the day. At some point, I took out the camera and started capturing little pieces of the morning. A squirrel clutching a pine cone, sunlight through dry grass. The outline of my own shadow stretched long across the path. Each photo felt like a small declaration. I am here. I am present. I am alive. In the afternoon, I found a small diner in the nearest town. I ordered a slice of pie and coffee. The waitress didn't ask if I was meeting anyone. She didn't ask anything at all. She just smiled and brought the food, and I sat there with the pie, the coffee, and the sound of clinking dishes and murmured conversation around me. It felt like being inside a story, the kind where nothing big happens, but everything matters. Later, back at the cabin, I built a fire and sat in front of it with my legs curled beneath me. I read for a while, then closed the book and stared into the flames. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to hold on to a tradition that no longer held me, a tradition that had become a ceremony of disappointment. I realized that what I had done this year, choosing myself, choosing solitude with intention, was not a break from the past. It was a continuation of it, but on my own terms. This would be my new tradition. Every year on the same date, I would go somewhere I had never been. I would carry something of Ted with me, something small like a scarf or a story, and I would live that day fully, not in grief, not in bitterness, but in gratitude for the life I had lived, for the woman I still was, for the peace I had earned through the quiet work of letting go. That night, I stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. They were brighter here than they ever were at home. I could see them clearly, scattered like old memories across the dark. I whispered something to them, not expecting an answer. Then I went inside, blew out the candle, and went to bed with the window cracked open, letting in the sounds of the night. And as I fell asleep, I knew I wouldn't be waiting anymore. I would be walking. I would be driving. I would be going places that no one had chosen for me. And in doing so, I would no longer be forgotten, not by others, but by myself.